So let's talk about placing vehicles inside a trust. So, first of all, a vehicle is a titled asset that has to be held in a business entity, like every other asset has to be held in. And most people, by default, use their straw man, their name, 9-digit social security number. They use that public business entity to hold their vehicle in. And that is the entity where you're going to have the most liability. So ultimately, if you get into some kind of accident and the fireworks go off and things go south, all that liability falls on you at that point. And yeah, that's what insurance is for. But even beyond that, we've seen all these, we've seen all the signs on the side of the highways with all the lawyer demons trying to get money for people wrecking in cars and whatnot. So that's all, because people are playing that game in the statutory public world. And if you're holding a car in your name, you're part of that game. So it's every time you're on the road, there is this thing in the back of your mind where what if something happens? I mean, that's why we all get insurance, right? Other than the fact that we have to. But so when we want to kind of figure out, okay, well, how do we hold this vehicle that has clearly a lot of liability on it? How do we hold it in something better? And that's where people start shifting that liability through different types of companies, typically public statutory companies. But when we come to this idea of holding a vehicle in a trust, particularly a private trust like the one we use inside our community, that is ultimately going to be the point where you're absolutely safest and you've shifted all liability completely away from yourself. So it's really quite simple, just like your person can own a vehicle, any type of a business can own a vehicle, including a trust and including the type of trust that we use. And so, each state is slightly different in terms of their paperwork and their process. But typically, you're going to go to your state DMV or tax collector's office. And in order to retitle and re-register a vehicle, the first thing that you're going to need to do is to make sure that there's no lien on it. Because as far as I'm aware, the state and these sorts of public offices, they won't let you switch that vehicle into a new entity until that lien is cleared. So that's the first thing. It's gonna, you're gonna have to have a paid off vehicle really if you want to just move it into a private trust. Once that's done, however, and the vehicle is paid off, then you're just going to need to bring your trust document. You usually don't even need your EIN. You need to have your ID, and then you're going to fill out some paperwork with them, and that's it. And then you need the sign off from the existing owner, whether that's yourself or it might be another party. And as long as you have all those things, they're going to just bing bang boom. They're going to title the vehicle, and you also have to re-register it typically. And so both of those do come with annoying fees, but other than that, it's quite a fair, straightforward process. So if you want to see proof of how I actually did it, you can jump in the community if you're not already in there. And I'm going to link a copy of my actual vehicle title. So, just to show proof that I do what I say. And, I'm operating in a place where I own nothing at all in my name. And that is the safest place to operate from, because even if I was sued, for wrongdoing in some kind of crazy vehicle thing, like in that crazy scenario, I have nothing. So it doesn't matter whether someone wins a however many $1 million judgment against me for my negligent behavior, they still don't have anything to take from me. Now, I'm not saying I want to be negligent or I want to do anything like that or get into an accident. Clearly, we don't typically. But if that did happen, I have nothing to take in the first place. The second aspect is, the trust, it's not my person anymore that's responsible for that vehicle. It's the trust, because it's fully in the name of one of my trusts. And so now all liability shifts to the trust. And when you look at how this trust works and why it's so powerful, being the fact that it's private and it's not under the government statutory jurisdiction, lawsuits and different kinds of aggressive actions against this trust, they are not able to pierce the veil and just with the way that this is constructed. And so if you want to again learn more about that, jump into the community, because there is nuance to the law and to how that works. But suffice it to say that, lawsuits are stopped, any kind of lawsuit is just stopped dead in its tracks when it meets a trust like this. So, recently I had a very interesting run-in with the police as I was driving cross country from California to Florida. And I haven't been pulled over by, the cops in well over a decade, just because I do speed sometimes and yeah, I do like certain things like that, but I'm overall a very safe driver, and, I try to just be very relaxed and take my time and listen to my music, or, something, just, I don't know, just relax. I don't try to get too stressed out when I'm driving. But on this drive, I was just driving in the slow lane. I was behind some truck, and I was just like going pretty slow. And I see this cop come up behind me, and they're tailgating me for a little bit, and then all of a sudden the lights go off. And I thought to myself, like, I wasn't at all scared like I would have been in the past. I was just very like perplexed. I was like, wait, I was just driving in the slow lane, like, unless they were trying to pull me over for speeding, like way back somewhere. But because there were points I was speeding, but still, I wasn't even really speeding enough where it would warrant like being pulled over like this at this point in time. So as I start to slow down and then get ready to pull off, another cop materializes. So now there are like two cop cars that are pulling me over right now, and now I'm like even less scared. I'm even more like overjoyed. I'm like, wow, I'm like that important, where like there's a whole fucking team of cops now that are on my ass. So I pull over, and both cops out of both cars start to disembark. So there's like three of them that I visibly see that are sort of like walking, and sort of having a conversation. And then one of them actually comes to my driver passenger's side window. And then, I drop the window, and they come up to the window, and, I start engaging with them. And, I was like, hey, officer. And the guys, was like, hello, sir. And the first thing he asked me was whether I realized that I blew through an immigration checkpoint. And then I scratched my chin, and I was like, wait, immigration checkpoint? Like, that's vaguely familiar. And, as I started to think about my previous day of driving, I actually realized that it did in fact blow right through an immigration checkpoint. The reason why I did that, though, was not because I've never even blown through any kind of toll or checkpoint type of thing before in my life, but on this long drive, there were several points where the highway was under construction, and so they diverted traffic via cones to one lane. And then at a certain point, it was like half a lane, so we were like driving half on one lane, half off on the curb. And so it was very strange. And then at several points, they would take those cones and then direct you off the highway temporarily and then back on. So this was happening at several points on my drive. And during one of these redirections, the cones kind of left the highway and redirected off of this frontage road to the side of the highway. And then it did sort of pass through this little overpass thingy. But part of why I didn't stop was the lane in front of me was completely clear. Like, there was nobody in there. There were people stopping to the right of me, but in my lane, it just looked like no one was stopping. And it also didn't even really look like there was no signs or anything. It didn't say there was a toll. Like, there was nothing. No, nothing. And there was someone in a booth waiting in the lane that I was in. But somehow, like, I just thought it was one of those lane redirection things where, I was on a frontage road and I was about to hit the highway again, and that was that. So I just blew through that shit. Like, I was going full speed right through the checkpoint. And as I blew through it, I kind of looked back in my rearview mirror, and like the guy in that booth was like waving his hand around, and I was just like, oh, I just kind of dismissed it at the time. As I was doing it, I was like, oh yeah, the guy's like waving me off. Great, So yeah, I keep driving, and this is hours later that I get pulled over. This was like 3 hours later, maybe. I mean, literally hours later, they, maybe they boloed my license or something, and then they pulled me over. And so I gave him my ID, because I did realize that, yeah, he was like, yeah, can I see some ID? I was like, sure. Because look, at the end of the day, like, I could have just stood my ground right there and not showed him anything, but I did realize that, yeah, I did, blow through a checkpoint, and I was like, okay, I'll identify myself. I have nothing to hide. My person doesn't break laws, really. My person doesn't have anything of material value, and neither does it have my vehicle. And I also realized that, depending on when they took my license and when they like figured out who I was and whatnot, there is a situation where they would try to find me or something like that. But I thought that would be the worst case scenario because, I wasn't really endangering anyone's life. I wasn't driving erratically. I just blew through a checkpoint, and there was not even a stop sign, like nothing. I didn't even know it was a checkpoint of any kind. And I told them that. I was just pretty, like, honestly, I told them. I was, like, a little confused, and I was like, yeah, I don't know, man. Like, what do you want me to do? So, they spend a while, like, looking over, going into their AI gin, in God We Trust machine and scanning my license. And then another one of their team comes back, and this guy is, like, the next level cop. Like, he's like the guerrilla cop who's like dressed in the full SWAT uniform. He's got like the elbow pads, he's got like the tattoos everywhere all the way up to his neck and on his arms. So like, he's ready to fucking, do something. And he comes up with my ID, and he's pretty friendly. And one thing I should mention is, before the second cop came back with my ID and came up, like, I was already ready in my mind where if they wanted to make an issue of this, I'm just going to tell them, like, in the name of Jesus Christ, this is who I'm with. Like, I'm not within God We Trust. This vehicle's registered, in a trust. Like, I'm on trust business. So whatever this is right now, like, who I am, and you can let me go because, I'm not doing anything unlawful. I have nothing crazy going on. And so in between the cops coming, up to my vehicle, I actually took out a copy of my trust, which was in my glove compartment, and I put it on the seat right next to me, in between me and the second officer came up. So as he comes up to my window and starts engaging me, like, the trust is right there. It's in full view of both of us, and I'm ready to just, like, address it and just sort of, if need be, just kind of assert my lawful rights under God. But basically how the conversation went was he was as friendly as a guerrilla SWAT cop could be. He just sort of like, was like, sir, were you aware there was a checkpoint? And I was like, no, I already told the other guy, like, I just wasn't aware there was a checkpoint. And he's like, oh, and then he's like, yeah, do you have any illegal drugs or, is there any people back there in your camper? I'm like, no, you can look back there. There's no people, there's no drugs, nothing. And the other thing that was funny too was, I was crossing through, I think, Texas at this time. I was outside of El Paso somewhere. So which makes sense. That's why there was an immigration checkpoint, and that's why if someone blows through it, yeah, they probably think you're human trafficking or smuggling something. But I actually did have like half a joint lying out right in the center console, and cannabis is illegal in Texas, so theoretically I guess I did have illegal drugs right in open view. But I wasn't even worried about that because that's medicinal and it's covered under my trust anyway. If like he really wanted to bring some shit like that up, again, that's where I assert my rights and that's it. Like, you're not, nothing's happening here. So he like quickly like looked around, but then he was just like, okay, like, just be careful next time. Handed me my license back and let me go. And then I drove off, and that was it. So it was an interesting encounter, I feel like in the past, I definitely would have been ticketed or something for something like that. But he just let me go without anything. And part of that is, it's just like a martial artist, like knowing how to fight. Like, you could probably tell by my demeanor that, look, and also it's not even just the demeanor. Like, if you really understand the spiritual aspect to this trust, even having that document right there in view, like in between me and this servant of the devil, like, that's all the protection I need. It's a preventatory, it's preemptive. I don't even need to say anything at that point. They just know. They already know that I know. And so they know that there's nothing they can get from me in this scenario. So, all this is to say that, definitely don't purposely break laws, like just to rile up police and do that. But at the same time, like, if you do end up in a situation, you want to make sure the liability is not on you, and you want to make sure that you're protected, and that's why we have this trust. So you can jump in the community and learn more about, you know, all the aspects of how we do this, and I look forward to seeing many of you in there. And for the rest of you, you know, good luck driving under the jurisdiction of the devil, because cops like that, you know, yeah, they're dressed in these big uniforms, ready to raid your vehicle and do all kinds of weird shit to you. So just, you know, be prepared. You know, have a concrete line of defense, and you know, God bless your success.